History will remember that the 21st century truly began on September 11th, 2001. The world that we have lived in during the last 20 years has been largely shaped by the attacks that took place that day on American soil. Global geopolitics in particular have been profoundly and permanently impacted by these events.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
Yet, the events of 9/11 remained mysterious and controversial. According to the official government and media narrative, 4 airliners were hijacked by 19 cutter-wielding terrorists. They were members of the jihadist network known as Al-Qaeda, led from Afghanistan by Saudi national Osama bin Laden. One of the planes is said to have crashed into the Pentagon near Washington, D.C. 2 others are said to have penetrated and exploded inside the Twin Towers of New York's World Trade Center, causing them to collapse vertically at near freefall speed. The 4th plane is believed to have escaped the terrorist control through the heroic intervention of its passengers and crashed in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. But this official account, now presented as historical fact in school textbooks, is contested by a significant portion of the population, pejoratively labeled conspiracy theorists by the guardians of orthodoxy.
Moi, je pense que le conspirationnisme débouche sur quelque chose d'extrêmement grave, c'est le négationnisme. Négationnisme, c'est-à-dire les gens qui disent les chambres à gaz n'ont pas existé.
Thanks to the work of a few hundred independent investigators relayed by dissident media over the internet, millions of people around the world are now convinced that Osama bin Laden did not instigate the terrorist attacks that are attributed to him. Far from claiming responsibility, as the perpetrators of terrorist attacks usually do, bin Laden has repeatedly claimed his innocence. Opponents of the official theory denounce a false flag operation. According to them, the attacks were planned from within the United States and blamed upon radical Islamism to justify the destruction of several nations across the Middle East under the guise of a war on terror. The objective of this film is not to demonstrate that the official narrative of the 9/11 attacks is a gigantic lie. This has already been done in excellent books and documentaries. We will simply summarize the main points that prove the official narrative to be a material impossibility. Our goal is to go beyond this criticism and to identify the real instigators of this operation as well as their objectives. Unless we understand precisely the global geopolitical project of the 9/11 conspirators, the historical meaning of the last 20 years will continue to elude us, and we will remain unable to anticipate, let alone prevent, the full implementation of this project. There are today 2 main dissenting theories on 9/11. The most widespread theory accuses the American administration or powerful elements within the administration of having set up a false flag operation to justify imperialist or neocolonialist wars already programmed since the 1990s. Another theory, less known to the Western public, incriminates a Zionist network acting from within the United States, whose goal is to lead America into wars against Israel's enemies. These 2 theories can be conveniently referred to as the inside job theory and the Mossad job theory. In this film, we will summarize the arguments of the Mossad job theory, which has been steadily gaining ground since Alan Sabrowski, a professor at the U.S. Military Academy, expressed in a 2011 article his belief that the 9/11 attacks were, and I quote, a classic Mossad orchestrated operation.
I have had long conversations with contacts at the Army War College, at Headquarters Marine Corps, and I've made it absolutely clear that it is 100% certain that 9/11 was a Mossad operation. Period.
Let's begin by pointing out that the two theories are not mutually exclusive. The United States and Israel have converging geostrategic interests, and their secret services have been closely linked since the 1960s. We will try to distinguish precisely which parts were handled by which. But first, let's briefly review the facts. Of the 4 planes allegedly hijacked by Al-Qaeda terrorists, at least 2 can be described as ghost planes. Let's start with the Boeing 757 of United Airlines Flight 93 from New Jersey to San Francisco. According to the official story, it crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after a struggle between the passengers and hijackers. However, no trace of the plane is visible on the images.
Doch für die ersten Augenzeugen an der Unfallstelle ist die weltbekannte Geschichte von Flug 93 bis heute ein ungelöstes Rätsel. Ernie Stahl, der Bürgermeister der nahegelegenen Gemeinde Shanksville, erinnert sich.
Ja, mein Schwager und ein guter Freund von mir waren die Ersten hier. Sie haben in Shanksville an einer Straßenecke gestanden und sich unterhalten. Ihr Wagen stand gleich in der Nähe und so waren sie die Ersten hier. Dann kam erst die Feuerwehr. Alle waren wie vor den Kopf gestoßen, weil sie zu einem Flugzeugabsturz gerufen wurden. Aber da war kein Flugzeug. Kein Flugzeug.
Sie wurden hier zu der Unfallstelle geschickt und da war kein Flugzeug?
Nein, da war nichts. Nur dieses Loch. Das ist es, was Sie sahen.
Ich dachte immer, das sei die Absturzstelle.
Das ist sie. Aber da ist nichts zu sehen. Das Flugzeug hat sich total zerlegt. Puff. Es krachte auf den Boden und löste sich auf. Vollkommen.
The Boeing 757 of American Airlines Flight 77 from Washington to Los Angeles, which allegedly crashed into the Pentagon, is equally unaccounted for. While 80 cameras around the Pentagon are supposed to have captured the plane's approach and impact, no convincing images have been made public. The lawn in front of the impact site is immaculate, and the 2 or 3 visible pieces of debris are ridiculously small.
That's what was starting me so curious. As I was trying to find something, there was no marks on the grass. Something never hit the ground. It didn't hit the heliport. I mean, it was a precision or awfully lucky hit. I mean, I don't know how it didn't bounce. I don't know how it hit directly in the side of the building without touching the ground, going as fast as it obviously was going. And again, the classic airplane crash has wreckage. I mean, they found axles from the Ryder truck in Oklahoma City. I can't believe they can't find an engine.
All the debunkers have to show for Flight 77 is a small piece of wreckage carrying an American Airlines serial number. But this piece could have been placed by anyone onto the grass after the impact. In fact, unidentified men in suits were seen meddling with the debris right after the impact, in direct violation of the rules of a crime scene. A contractor who was only 100 yards away from the point of impact stated, "It was DPS, the guys in the black coats. They were here right then and there. That's what I don't understand. Where did they come from? Maybe they knew something. I don't know."
The two planes that crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center raise other questions. They are American Airlines Flight 11 for the North Tower and United Airlines Flight 175 for the South Tower. Here again, the absence of aircraft debris in the rubble of the towers raises questions.
For American 11, the plane that hit the first tower, we were told that the cockpit voice recorder was never found. For United 175, the plane that hit the second tower, we were also told that the cockpit voice recorder was never found. This is very curious, as black boxes are built specifically to withstand extremely high temperatures and the most violent of impact.
In addition, aviation professionals have reported impossibilities in the aircraft's behavior, as described by official radar records. Their speeds, respectively 465 miles per hour and more than 540 miles per hour, rule out the possibility that they were Boeing 767s, since they cannot reach such speeds at low altitude, let alone be directed under these conditions with such precision by totally inexperienced terrorists.
At 30,000 feet, the air is very thin, and the airplane can easily travel beyond 500 miles an hour without encountering much resistance. As soon as it starts descending, however, the atmosphere gets thicker and thicker, and the plane needs to reduce the speed accordingly in order to preserve its structural integrity. Below 10,000 feet in altitude, speeds around 250 miles per hour are recommended. In fact, each airplane has a specific maximum operating velocity called VMO, which should never be exceeded at low altitudes. Never means never for a reason. Should the VMO be exceeded, a phenomenon called flutter can occur, which can quickly cause irreversible damage.
How do you feel about United 175 reaching 510 knots?
Physically impossible. To have a clocked airspeed of 510 knots with a commercial airliner at sea level is physically impossible.
Flight 175 that hit the second tower, they said it was going at roughly 560 miles an hour at sea level.
No, that's impossible. You need so much power to push yourself through that air. So the engines have the right amount of horsepower for cruising at 30,000 feet at 500 plus miles an hour. To do that at ground level, you need 6 times that amount of power. Those engines can't put out 6 times more power. If you changed out the motors so they were motors that had 6 times the thrust, then theoretically you could, but then the structure is not strong enough.
Several theories have been put forward to explain this impossibility. First, it was assumed that the planes that hit the Twin Towers were military planes under civilian camouflage, possibly guided by automatic pilots, drones that is. It still remains difficult to explain how aircraft with light aluminum fuselage and wings could have passed through the thick steel beams of the towers and disappeared entirely, including their wings, without breaking or even deforming on impact. Truth be told, it is totally inexplicable. In these images, the plane does not even slow down when it hits the steel structure. In addition, some witnesses say they did not see planes and have never changed their story on this point, even after seeing the planes on TV broadcasts. One of them is David Honshu, photographer of the New York Daily News.
Next is image of the towers on fire.
That's actually the plane slamming into the South Tower. I was less than 100 yards away from the building. I was standing on West Street, and we heard this noise that seemed to come from everywhere, but had no idea what it was. And then the South Tower just exploded. It just blew up. And somebody said that was a plane. I was like, I was underneath it. I was looking at the tower. I had my camera in my hand. I heard the noise. I never saw the airplane.
This is why some investigators believe that the initial explosions in the towers were caused by bombs planted ahead of time in the buildings, and that the planes seen by millions of people on television are virtual images overlaid and synchronized by video composition. According to investigator Ace Baker, these images filmed by Kai Simonson from a Fox helicopter gave up the deception by showing the nose of the plane briefly emerging from the other side of the South Tower. Whatever the truth may be, let us just remember that none of the allegedly hijacked Boeings ended up where the official story claims they did, whether at the Pentagon, at Shanksville, or at the Twin Towers. But then, where did the 4 United Airlines and American Airlines planes go, and what happened to their passengers? The most plausible theory is that these flights never took place, and their passenger lists, which are very small, are fake. On the day of the attacks, at least 5 military exercises were being conducted by NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. These exercises included simulated airliner hijackings.
The real reason for the failure to intercept the 4 aircraft seems to have been the high number of military exercises that were being run by NORAD on September 11 out of their base in Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado. This unusual number of exercises had 2 major consequences. 1, they moved a large number of fighters out to Canada and Alaska. 2, they created a major confusion in the system as soon as the real hijackings were reported.
We have a hijacked aircraft headed towards New York, and we need someone to scramble some F-16s or something up there to help us out.
Is this real world or exercise?
No, this is not an exercise manifest.
As a result, many of the airliners moving across air traffic radar screens were only virtual, with no way for the controllers to tell the difference. It would have been very easy to virtually hijack these virtual planes and then pretend they were real, with collusion between the airline companies and the airports.
You know, let's get rid of this goddamn sim. Hey, turn the sim switches off. Get rid of that crap.
I hope they cancel the exercise because this is ridiculous.
But they were not canceled, even after both towers in New York had been hit. When everyone knew America was under attack, the war games continued.
Anyone with a basic understanding of the steel structure of skyscrapers, and particularly of New York's Twin Towers, will find it hard to believe that airplanes could have caused structural damage sufficient to prompt their collapse. Donald Trump happens to be a real estate developer who is familiar with these issues. Here is what he said on the day of the attacks.
Well, it was an architectural defect. You know, the World Trade Center was always known as a very, very strong building. This was an unbelievably powerful building. If you know anything about structure, it was one of the first buildings that was built from the outside. The steel, the reason the World Trade Center had such narrow windows is that in between all the windows, you had the steel on the outside. So you had the steel on the outside of the building, and you had big, heavy I-beams. That's why when I first looked at it, I couldn't believe it, because there was a hole in the steel. And this is steel that was, you remember the width of the windows in the World Trade Center, folks. I think you know, if you were ever up there, they were quite narrow. And in between was this heavy steel. I said, how could a plane, even a 767 or 747 or whatever it might have been, how could it possibly go through the steel? I happen to think that they had not only a plane, but they had bombs that exploded almost simultaneously, because I just can't imagine anything being able to go through that wall. Most buildings are built with the steel is on the inside around the elevator shaft. This one was built from the outside, which is the strongest structure you can have.
Donald Trump never spoke again on the subject, but he is not the only specialist to have expressed doubts. Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth comprises more than 3,000 architects and engineers who categorically deny the possibility that the collapse of the Twin Towers could have resulted from the impact of the planes or the fires that followed.
Steel frame fire-protected buildings do not collapse due to fire. Until 9/11, we have not had these collapses. And since 9/11, we've had a whole bunch of extremely hot fires, as you can see here. Not one of them collapsed either. And yet these fires brought these buildings down in 12 seconds after burning for less than an hour.
To speak of the collapse of the towers is misleading. The towers literally exploded floor by floor, pulverizing concrete and throwing steel beams weighing several tons across hundreds of yards. The pyroclastic dust that immediately filled the streets of New York, similar to that of a volcano, indicates a high temperature mix of hot gases and relatively dense solid particles, a phenomena impossible in a simple collapse.
And this dust made it almost across to New Jersey, across the river. Thick, billowing, laying a carpet of 4 to 6 inches thick around lower Manhattan, pulverized to 100 micron to 10 mil particles, almost like talcum powder, some of it. It's very, very fine. Where's the grinder that produced this?
Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth also draws attention to a third skyscraper that collapsed 7 hours after the Twin Towers, even though it was not hit by any aircraft.
Most Americans are completely unfamiliar with the third worst structural failure in modern history. I mean, here is a 47-story skyscraper. At 5:20 in the afternoon, it drops like a rock, and I mean this fast. Free fall acceleration, straight down, uniformly, symmetrically.
The general public was kept in the dark about the collapse of this third 47-story tower, and for an obvious reason. It can only be explained by controlled demolition, a process that requires months of preparation.
We've got a building that came down in its own footprint, so all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time in order for that structure to fall the way that we saw.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
A particularly disturbing fact is that the collapse of Tower 7, also known as the Solomon Brothers building, was mistakenly announced by the BBC 20 minutes before it took place.
Jane, what more can you tell us about the Solomon Brothers building and its collapse?
As you can see behind me, the Trade Center appears to be still burning. We see these huge clouds of smoke and ash.
There is much more evidence that the official 9/11 story is a web of lies. It has already been the subject of numerous documentaries. So let's get straight to the point and ask the question, who benefits from the crime?
Ariel Sharon est entouré de gardes du corps et de policiers tendus. Des fidèles musulmans et des députés arabes israéliens sont là et l'interpellent.
Je suis venu avec un message de paix. Je crois que nous pouvons vivre avec les Palestiniens. Je suis venu voir ce qu'il se passe sur le lieu le plus sacré du judaïsme. Ce n'était pas une provocation.
In 2001, Israel's reputation had fallen to its lowest level in international public opinion. Condemnations were voiced from all sides against its apartheid and colonization policies, and its systematic war against Palestinian leadership structures. The attacks of 9/11 instantly reversed this trend.
CNN's Mike Hanna in our bureau in Israel joins us now. Whenever something like this happens, I guess you look to the Middle East. Mike, what's the situation in Israel now?
There has been a blanket condemnation from all leaders in the region of the events that have taken place there and commiseration about the extensive loss of life that has occurred. However, when news of the events started to filter through in Palestinian areas, there were sporadic incidents of celebration in the streets in the East Jerusalem and in various parts of the West Bank. Palestinians took to the streets in small groups, celebrating what they said was an attack against the United States. The United States, blamed by some Palestinians for its ongoing support, as it is seen, of Israel.
Americans experienced the attacks as an act of hatred on the part of the Arab world, and thus felt immediate sympathy for Israel.
Our heart is with America, and our heart is with the thousands of families that have lost their children, their brothers, mothers. For Israel, it's a day of mourning. Permit me to say that today each of us feels American, like an American. It was not an attack only upon America, but an attack upon civilization.
Aaron, I'm talking to U.S. officials who are obviously working on who's responsible for this. Their working thesis is that this is overseas terrorism, not domestic. In terms of claims of responsibility so far, there is an Agence France Presse report in which a group with the word Palestine in the name claims responsibility.
Benjamin Netanyahu could not suppress his satisfaction in the aftermath of the attacks. It is very good. It will generate immediate sympathy, strengthen the bond between our two peoples, because we have experienced terror for so many decades, but the United States has now experienced a massive hemorrhage of terror. It should be remembered that before becoming Prime Minister of Israel in 1996, Netanyahu, who was already a familiar face on American television, had written 3 eerily prescient books designed to warn Americans of the Arab terrorist threat.
Well, I would like to tell the American people that Israel and America are natural allies. We both share a democratic way of life. We both have common foes that we need to defend ourselves against. We must maintain our focus on the common bond and work together towards cementing this alliance.
It is not surprising then to hear him boast on CNN in 2006 that he predicted as far back as 1995 that,
and I said that if the West doesn't wake up to the suicidal nature of militant Islam, the next thing you'll see is the militant Islam is bringing down the World Trade Center.
The attacks of 9/11 indeed appeared as the validation of Netanyahu's prophecies. 9 days later, on September 20th, the American press published a statement by the former Prime Minister entitled, "Today we are all Americans." In it, Netanyahu developed his favorite propaganda line, that the anger of the Arabs against Israel was in fact directed at the United States. I quote, "For the bin Ladens of the world, Israel is merely a sideshow. America is the target." 3 days later, the New Republic replied on behalf of Americans, "We are all Israelis now."
Depuis 2 jours, Yasser Arafat, le président de l'autorité palestinienne, fait tout son possible pour améliorer l'image des Palestiniens auprès des États-Unis. Il ne veut surtout pas que l'opinion internationale fasse un amalgame entre islam et terrorisme. Plus question aujourd'hui d'offrir au monde des images des Palestiniens sautant de joie après les attentats. L'enjeu est important car au même moment, Ariel Sharon multiplie ses opérations en territoire palestinien comme ici à Jéricho. Le Premier ministre israélien tente de son côté de profiter au maximum de la situation. Ce matin, il a déclaré « Nous avons notre Ben Laden à nous, il s'appelle Yasser Arafat ».
Overnight, after the 9/11 attacks, Western opinion had amalgamated the Arab world and the Palestinian resistance with Islamic terrorism. Americans even began to positively reconsider Israel's oppression of the Palestinians as part of the global struggle against Islamic terrorism. Unconditional U.S. support for Israel has resulted in 20 years of U.S. military operations on behalf of Israel. Indeed, U.S. invasions and hybrid wars since 9/11 have all been directed against Israel's declared enemies. It is widely acknowledged that the United States has not benefited from these wars and that they have actually damaged its economy and ruined its image in the world.
We've become a third world country. So, the worst of all things has happened. We owe $20 trillion and we're a mess. We haven't even started. And we've spent $6 trillion in the Middle East. $6 trillion in the Middle East. We could have rebuilt our country twice.
I'm here to announce the completion of our withdrawal from Afghanistan and the end of the military mission to evacuate American citizens.
The return to power of the Taliban in Afghanistan, 20 years after their expulsion in 2001, is the most recent illustration of the abject failure of U.S. imperialist policy since 9/11. In 2007, academics John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt sent shockwaves with their book, The Israeli Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, in which they exposed the exorbitant power of pro-Israel influence groups, the most powerful of which is AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. We believe, the authors state, the activities of the groups and individuals who make up the lobby are the main reason why the United States pursues policies in the Middle East that make little sense on either strategic or moral grounds.
I will take that analysis a step further and argue that its influence has been largely negative. In a nutshell, our argument is that the lobby, working with Israel itself, has pushed U.S. Middle East policy in ways that are not in the American national interest. Israel, and especially the lobby, were two of the main driving forces behind the decision to invade Iraq. It is hard to imagine that war happening in their absence. I might add that there is hardly any evidence that the oil companies and the oil-producing states were pushing for war with Iraq.
The power of what is euphemistically called the Israeli lobby is considerable. However, during the first Gulf War in 1990, pressure and corruption could not force U.S. President George Bush Sr. to overthrow Saddam Hussein and occupy Iraq. For that, it took the attacks of September 11, 2001. This is what definitively shifted American foreign and military policy in the direction desired by Israel and allowed George W. Bush to authorize in 2003 the invasion of Iraq that his father had refused in 1991.
American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Planning for the 9/11 attacks probably started as far back as 1980. That year, Isser Harel, founder of the Israeli Secret Service, prophesied in an interview with Michael Evans that Islamic terrorism would eventually strike America in its phallic symbol. And I quote, "Your biggest phallic symbol is in New York City, and your tallest building will be the phallic symbol they will hit." The actual technical preparations probably coincided with Benjamin Netanyahu's arrival in power in 1996, followed by Ehud Barak in July 1999, and by Ariel Sharon in March of 2001, who returned Netanyahu to the post of foreign minister in 2002. It should be noted that both Netanyahu and Barak were temporarily out of government in September 2001, which, if one draws a parallel with David Ben-Gurion at the time of the Kennedy assassination, suggests that they were then operating behind the scenes where covert operations are masterminded. Officially, after leaving the government in March 2001, Ehud Barak was recruited as a consultant to security firm SCP Partners, a Mossad front company based in New York State. On the morning of September 11th, he happened to be in the studios of BBC World, the world's most widely broadcast television station. An hour after the collapse of the North Tower, he appeared before millions of stunned viewers to name bin Laden as the #1 suspect and to present his plan for a counterattack.
The world will not be the same from today on. It's an attack against our whole civilization. I don't know who is responsible. I believe we will know in 12 hours. If it is a kind of bin Laden organization, and even if it's something else, I believe that this is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort led by the United States, the UK, Europe, and Russia against all sources of terror. And we should cooperate with
preemptively,
both preemptive and by diplomatic means, namely rogue states. There are 5 of them: Iran, Iraq, Libya, North Korea. These kind of states should be treated as rogue states.
In conclusion, the Israeli deep state had an obvious motive for the 9/11 crime. But does its profile really fit the crime? Israel has a long history and experience of false flag terrorist attacks. This specialty originated before the creation of Israel with the attack on the King David Hotel in Jerusalem on July 22, 1946. On that day, 6 Irgun terrorists dressed as Arabs planted 500 pounds of explosives concealed in milk cans in the hotel, which served as the headquarters for the British administrative authorities. The suspicions of a British officer led to a shootout with the terrorists. The members of the commando escaped by setting off the explosives, killing 91 people, mostly British, but also 15 Jews.
In scenes eerily reminiscent of New York 55 years later, the Jerusalem bomb was the beginning of terrorism as a media event, designed to capture the world's attention.
The latest casualty list included 65 killed, 47 injured.
The perpetrators, Zionist Jews, members of Menachem Begin's Irgun terrorist network.
A similar ploy was employed in Egypt in 1954 with Operation Susanna, which was intended to undermine Britain's withdrawal from the Suez Canal Zone. Egyptian Jews trained in Israel carried out several bombings against British targets that were blamed on the Muslim Brotherhood. The accidental detonation of one of the explosives gave away the plot. The scandal was downplayed in the Israeli and American media, but it was not until 2005, 50 years later, that the Israeli state officially acknowledged its responsibility. The most famous of the Israeli false flag attacks took place on June 8, 1967, during the Six-Day War. On a sunny day, 3 unmarked bombers and 3 Israeli torpedo boats bombed, strafed, and torpedoed the USS Liberty, an unarmed American ship, for 75 minutes with the clear intention of leaving no survivors.
The original attacking aircraft were French Mirage, and then they sent a couple of Mystère, and they dropped the napalm canisters. The outside of the ship, the superstructure, was on fire.
It was so hot that it was peeling the skin of the ship off. I knew exactly what it was because I couldn't put it out. It had to be napalm. And it burned a lot of people. You could smell human flesh burning.
And my job was to try to get probably 20 or 30 wounded sailors out to the main deck and to the life rafts. So I went up and looked out myself before I tried to get anyone up. And that's when I observed a motor torpedo boat, Israeli, plainly marked with the Star of David, machine gunning our life rafts.
The massacre was fortunately interrupted by the approach of a Soviet spy ship, but over 200 crew members, mostly engineers, technicians, and interpreters, were killed or seriously injured. If the Israelis had succeeded in sinking the ship without leaving any witnesses or survivors, Egypt would have been accused of the crime and the United States would have been drawn into the war and sided with Israel. With Egypt an ally of the USSR, a new world war might have started.
Once the Israelis knew the US jets were in the air, they summoned the American naval attaché and told him there had been a terrible mistake. The American planes were recalled. As they returned, Israeli helicopters flew out to the Liberty.
This one had some personnel from the Israeli government, and the U.S. naval attaché dropped a brown paper sack on the deck in the forepart of the ship, weighted down with an orange, had a business card in it. It landed right next to the severed leg of one of the deck personnel.
And the note said, "Do you have casualties?"
Of course, false flag operations are only recognized as such when they fail. It is therefore impossible to know the exact number of operations that have been mounted by Israel and falsely attributed to Arab terrorists, but Israel's reputation in this area is well established within intelligence circles the world over. A report by the U.S. Army School for Advanced Military Studies cited by the Washington Times on September 10, 2001, the day before the attacks, describes Mossad as, and I quote, "wild card, ruthless and cunning, has capability to target U.S. forces and make it look like a Palestinian/Arab act," end of quote. After 9/11, it became clear that Israel had set up fake al-Qaeda cells in Palestine to justify military operations against populations of the Gaza Strip. At a press conference, the head of the Palestinian Security Service produced telephone and bank records that proved that these cells had been created by the Israeli Secret Service. These examples do not constitute proof that Israel was also behind the false flag operation of 9/11, but they do justify a presumption of guilt. Is there any convincing evidence of this guilt? That is what we will now examine. One of the clues to Israel's involvement in the 9/11 attacks is the behavior of a group of individuals known as the Dancing Israelis. They were seen by various witnesses standing on the roof of a van bearing the Urban Moving Systems logo and parked in Jersey City. They were rejoicing and taking pictures of themselves just as the first plane hit the North Tower.
And I could see that they were like happy. You know, they didn't look shocked to me. You know, they didn't look shocked.
The police, alerted by witnesses, immediately issued a search alert. TV stations reported the information, commingling it with other reports of suspects, quote, from the Middle East.
And Jack, we have learned now that authorities are looking for a number of vehicles, 2 cars with at least 2 men of Middle Eastern descent in the Hanscom area. And nationally, they're looking for a white Chevy van with New Jersey plates. And on the back bumper, it says something to the effect of Urban Moving System.
Several phone calls alerted the police to people who, quote, looked Palestinian, unquote, raising suspicions of an Islamic attack.
City Police 385. We have a white van. There's 3 guys in there. They look like Palestinians. They're going around a building. There's a minivan heading towards the Howard Tunnel. I see the guy by North Airport mixing some drugs, and he has no street uniform on. He has what? He's dressed like an Arab.
Had the young men seen rejoicing on the roof of their Urban Moving Systems van not been apprehended, they would have undoubtedly added to the rumors of Arabs or Palestinians celebrating the attacks. But luckily, their van was intercepted at around 4 p.m. with 5 men inside.
We had received an all-points bulletin, and I just happened to see the van and, hollered over to my lieutenant, I think that could be the van. We checked it out, and it was. We were all on edge, obviously, so I really wasn't looking to make friends with these people, and neither were the officers that I were with. Once we started talking to them, they were pretty much like, hey, we're not against you, we're with you.
They were indeed from the Middle East, but more precisely from Israel. 2 of them were formally identified as Mossad agents. The 5 officially worked for a moving company called Urban Moving Systems, whose owner, a certain Dominique Otto Suter, fled to Tel Aviv on September 14th and was never investigated.
Not long after the arrests, the offices of Urban Moving were simply abandoned. Almost everything was left behind.
Yuval Aviv is a counterterrorism advisor to the U.S. Congress.
but was once a spy for Israel's secret service Mossad. He says Urban Moving was a front company for Israeli intelligence, and that some of its workers were spying illegally in the US.
Israel has engaged in intelligence gathering in friendly countries. Some of it is done with permission, and some of it probably has been done without permission in areas that is vital to Israeli interest.
The 5 dancing Israelis were the only suspects arrested on the day of the attacks. Their Israeli citizenship was reported the next day by reporter Paulo Lima in the local New Jersey newspaper, the Bergen Record, based on sources close to the investigation. Quote, "It looked like they knew what was going to happen when they were in Liberty State Park," unquote, the officer reportedly said. No major media outlet picked up on this information, nor did any media ever mention again these Israeli suspects. The FBI's 579-page report on the subsequent investigation was partially declassified in 2005. It reveals several important facts. First, when developed, photos taken by the suspects in front of the burning North Tower confirm what witnesses said. Quote, "They smiled, hugged one another, and gave high fives," unquote. To justify their satisfaction, the suspects stated that they were simply happy that, because of these terrorist attacks, I quote, "the United States will take steps to stop terrorism in the world," end quote. Yet, at that time, before the second tower was hit, most Americans believed the crash was accidental.
Well, obviously, we don't know if this was, if it was a plane, and I underline if it was. We don't know if it would have been deliberate or accidental. We know so little now, other than what we can see from these pictures.
It was discovered that the 5 Israelis employed by Urban Moving Systems were also connected to another moving company called Classic International Movers, which employed yet another 4 Israelis later arrested for their contacts with the 19 suspected Islamic hijackers. After this incriminating evidence comes the most troubling part of the FBI report, namely its conclusion that, and I quote, "the FBI no longer had any investigative interest in the 5 detainees." In fact, an FBI letter dated September 25, 2001 proves that less than 2 weeks after the events, the FBI had already decided to close the investigation and asked the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service to proceed with appropriate immigration proceedings for the 5 detainees. The 5 dancing Israelis were held for a total of 71 days in a Brooklyn jail before being quietly returned to Israel on the inconsequential charge of visa violation. 3 of them were later invited to an Israeli TV show in November 2001, where one of them stated, "Our purpose was to document the event."
The fact of the matter is, we are coming from a country that experiences terror daily. Our purpose was to document the event.
Which implies prior knowledge of the event. The 5 dancing Israelis are just the tip of a vast iceberg. In September 2001, federal law enforcement was busy dismantling the largest Israeli spy ring ever discovered on American soil.
Since September 11th, more than 60 Israelis have been arrested or detained, either under the new Patriot anti-terrorism law or for immigration violations. A handful of active Israeli military were among those detained, according to investigators, who say some of the detainees also failed polygraph questions when asked about alleged surveillance activities against and in the United States. There is no indication that the Israelis were involved in the 9/11 attacks, but investigators suspect that the Israelis may have gathered intelligence about the attacks in advance and not shared it. Numerous classified documents obtained by Fox News indicate that even prior to September 11th, as many as 140 other Israelis had been detained or arrested in a secretive and sprawling investigation into suspected espionage by Israelis in the United States. Investigators from numerous government agencies are part of a working group that's been compiling evidence since the mid-90s.
In the summer of 2001, the Drug Enforcement Agency issued a report that was revealed to the public by Intelligence Online magazine in March 2002. According to this report, 140 Israeli spies aged 20 to 30 had been arrested between March 2001 and September 11th, and 60 more would be arrested shortly after September 11th. They had accessed at least 36 sensitive Defense Department sites.
The first part of the investigation focuses on Israelis who say they are art students from the University of Jerusalem and Bezalel Academy. They repeatedly made contact with U.S. government personnel, the report says, by saying they wanted to sell cheap art or handiwork. Documents say they, quote, targeted and penetrated military bases, the DEA, FBI, and dozens of other government facilities, and even secret offices and unlisted private homes of law enforcement and intelligence personnel.
The report states that most of them said during interrogations that they, I quote, served in military intelligence, electronic surveillance intercept, and/or explosive ordnance units. Some have been linked to high-ranking officials in the Israeli military. One was the son of a two-star general, one served as the bodyguard to the head of the Israeli army, one served in a Patriot missile unit. Another acknowledged he could blow up buildings, bridges, cars, and anything else that he needed to. End of quote. What is particularly interesting is that, according to the DEA report, I quote, the Hollywood, Florida area seems to be a central point for these individuals, end quote. More than 30 of the 140 Israeli spies identified prior to 9/11 resided in or near Hollywood, Florida. This geographic area is also where 14 of the 19 alleged Islamic hijackers had congregated. A mighty strange coincidence. What was the relationship between Israeli spies and Islamic terrorism? According to the embarrassed explanation of the media, the formers were only monitoring the latter. Let's hear David Pujadas, propelled to France 2 primetime TV newscast just 1 week before September 11th.
Toujours à propos d'Israël, mais concernant l'Afghanistan maintenant, cette affaire d'espionnage qui sème le trouble, un réseau israélien a été démantelé aux États-Unis, notamment en Floride. L'une de ses missions aurait été de pister les hommes d'Al-Qaïda, c'était avant les attentats du 11 septembre. Certaines sources vont même plus loin, elles indiquent que le Mossad n'aurait pas livré toutes les informations en sa possession aux États-Unis.
In such a presentation, Israel comes out clean, since you cannot blame a spy agency for not sharing its information.
Question. Les espions présumés du Mossad se trouvaient-ils là par hasard ou enquêtaient-ils sur les réseaux d'Al-Qaïda?
Les services de renseignement israéliens, si tant est que l'hypothèse se confirme, ont pu effectivement avoir, grosso modo, dans leur œil, pour cible certains islamistes sur le territoire des États-Unis, ça ne veut pas dire qu'ils étaient en mesure de prédire ce qui allait se passer.
In reality, Israeli agents most likely did a lot more than monitoring the so-called future hijackers. They were financing and manipulating them, and probably made them disappear shortly before and after the attacks. It is known that $100,000 passed through the account of Hanan Serfati, one of the arrested Israeli spies, who rented 2 Hollywood apartments on the same street as Mohammed Atta, one of the alleged hijackers of American Airlines Flight 11. It was also reported in the New York Times on February 19, 2009, that Ali al-Jarrah, a cousin of one of the alleged hijackers of United Airlines Flight 93, had been spying for Mossad on the Palestinian resistance and Hezbollah for 25 years. But of course, none of these leads were thoroughly investigated. The reason is that in 2001, the head of the Justice Department's Criminal Division was Michael Chertoff, the son of a rabbi and a Mossad agent. All Israeli spies arrested by the FBI, including the dancing Israelis, owe him their impunity and repatriation to Israel. Chertoff is a key man in the 9/11 operation. In 2005, he was appointed Secretary of Homeland Security in charge of the fight against terrorism on American soil, which allowed him to control dissident citizens and restrict access to evidence under the pretext of national security.
What's your general viewpoint about people who think the federal government was involved in 9/11?
I think that that's in the same category as Holocaust denial and those people who still aren't convinced that President Obama was born in Hawaii. It's kind of a out there conspiracy theory which does not warrant a lot of attention.
The 200 Israeli agents arrested shortly before and after 9/11, as well as the 5 dancing Israelis arrested on the same day, sit on the lower rungs of the conspirators' organizational chart. They are foot soldiers dedicated to the cause, but obeying orders without knowing all the ins and outs of the operation. What we need to do now is to identify the suspected leaders of the conspiracy, the high-level decision-makers such as Michael Chertoff. Let us first turn our attention to a group of senior officials believed to control U.S. foreign policy under George W. Bush. They are known as neoconservatives. Neoconservatism is a Jewish political movement that grew out of the editorial staff of Monthly Commentary, published by the American Jewish Committee. As Gail Beckerman wrote in 2006 in the American Jewish Daily, The Forward, if there is an intellectual movement in America to whose invention Jews can lay sole claim, neoconservatism is it. It is a fact that as a political philosophy, neoconservatism was born among the children of Jewish immigrants and is now largely the intellectual domain of those immigrants' grandchildren. The first generation of neoconservatives came from the pacifist and anti-imperialist left.
I got mixed up in the late 50s, before I became the editor of Commentary, with the nascent peace movement, which was then concerned about nuclear testing. I was also involved in an informal way with what got to be called the New Left.
It was shortly after Israel's 1967 annexation of the Arab territories that they underwent their conversion to militarism and imperialism, realizing, on the one hand, that Israel's survival depended on American military support, and on the other hand, that Israel's population targets required the fall of the Soviet Union, which was holding back Jewish emigration from its territories. These two objectives converged into a desire to strengthen U.S. military power and presence in the Middle East. That is why neoconservative leader Irving Kristol wrote in 1973 that presidential candidate George McGovern's proposal to cut the military budget by 30% should be fought. This proposition, Kristol wrote, is to drive a knife into the heart of Israel. Jews don't like a big military budget, but it is now in the interest of Jews to have a large and powerful military establishment in the United States. American Jews who care about the survival of the State of Israel have to say, no, we don't want to cut the military budget. It is important to keep that military budget big so that we can defend Israel. In order to link American interests with those of Israel, the neoconservatives hired the services of two ambitious and unscrupulous goyim, Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, and invested the Republican Party, transforming it from a traditionally isolationist party into a militarist and interventionist party. In 1980, Ronald Reagan rewarded the neoconservatives for their support to his election campaign by giving them a dozen positions in national security and foreign policy. Richard Pearl and Douglas Feith joined the Department of Defense. Richard Pipes joined the National Security Council. Paul Wolfowitz, Louis Libby, and Michael Ledeen joined the State Department. From 1996, during the Clinton years, the neoconservatives put all their weight into a new think tank, the Project for a New American Century, PNAC, headed by William Kristol and Robert Kagan. PNAC recommended taking advantage of the defeat of communism to strengthen American hegemony by preventing the emergence of a new rival. In its September 2000 report titled Rebuilding America's Defenses, PNAC suggested that, and I quote, the United States must retain sufficient forces able to rapidly deploy and win multiple simultaneous large-scale wars. The process of transformation is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor." End of quote. Remember the reference to Pearl Harbor, to which we will return. PNAC's neocon executives played the American imperialist card by draping themselves in the patriotic narrative of America's civilizing mission.
Alors en fait aujourd'hui, d'après vous, ce qui peut arriver de mieux au monde, c'est que l'Amérique réussisse sa mission universelle, sa mission civilisatrice.
Effectivement, nous pourrions aider beaucoup de pays de cette façon. On pense à l'Irak, on pense même à l'Arabie Saoudite, où il y a effectivement des gens qu'on aimerait bien libérer. Malheureusement, bien souvent, nous ne pouvons pas intervenir.
But their duplicity was made obvious in a 1996 report published by the Israeli think tank Institute for Advanced Strategic and Political Studies. The report, titled "A Clean Break," was addressed to the new Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Its authors included neoconservatives Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, David Wertheimer. Signatories are closely associated with PNAC. As its title suggests, the Clean Break report called on Netanyahu to break with the 1993 Oslo Accords, in which Israel pledged to return to the Palestinians the territories occupied since 1967. The authors suggested that the new prime minister should instead, and I quote, "engage every possible energy on rebuilding Zionism and reaffirm Israel's right to the illegally occupied territories." Another quote, "Our claim to the land is legitimate and noble. Only the unconditional acceptance by Arabs of our rights, especially in their territorial dimension, is a solid basis for the future." It should be noted that the duplicity of certain PNAC members was already known. In the 1970s, Richard Pearl was accused by the FBI of passing classified documents to Israel. Shortly afterwards, Douglas Feith was expelled from the National Security Council for the same reason.
God bless America, land that I love.
George W. Bush's election in November 2000 had raised suspicions of fraud.
Through the night with a light.
Dick Cheney, who had run his campaign, positioned himself as vice president and introduced 24 crypto-Zionist neocons in key positions. At the State Department, Colin Powell was surrounded by neoconservative aides such as David Wormser, one of the signatories of the Clean Break report. The National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice was surrounded by neocons Philip Zelikow, William Lutte, Elliot Abrams, and later Elliot Cohen. But it was mainly at the Pentagon, under the direction of Donald Rumsfeld, that most influential neocons succeeded in shaping American military policy. Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary, became the soul of the Pentagon, with Douglas Feith at his side as Under-Secretary. Richard Pearl occupied the crucial position of Director of Defense Policy Board, responsible for defining military strategy. 8 months into the Bush administration, the catastrophic event, the new Pearl Harbor that the PNAC had called for, had materialized. It signaled nothing less than an invisible coup d'etat.
This is Pearl Harbor. This is the Pearl Harbor of the 21st century for us. And the president will have to deal with these people overseas that are telling us they're going to destroy us. He's going to have to deal with it.
President Bush's powerlessness is epitomized by the position he found himself in at the time of the events. In an elementary school classroom, reading a children's book titled The Pet Goat.
But the goat did something that made the girls stand mad. Go on.
Meanwhile, his vice president, Dick Cheney, a neocon mercenary, had taken control of the government. It was a situation comparable to the crypto-Zionist Lyndon Johnson's takeover after the Kennedy assassination, the main difference being that Bush had been reduced to a puppet, not a corpse. On September 19th and 20th, Richard Pearl's Defense Policy Board met with Paul Wolfowitz and Bernard Lewis. They wrote a letter to President Bush on behalf of the PNAC, reminding him of his historic mission, and I quote, "Even if the evidence does not link Iraq directly to the attack, any strategy aiming at the eradication of terrorism and its sponsors must include a determined effort to remove Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq. Failure to undertake such an effort will constitute an early and perhaps decisive surrender in the war on international terrorism." End of quote. This was an ultimatum.
Saddam Hussein has been supporting international terror. We have to be rid of Saddam Hussein once and for all. That regime must go, and that's what we argue in our letter.
In September 2002, Douglas Feith, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, founded the Pentagon's Office of Special Plans, where he appointed Abram Shulsky, a close associate of Wolfowitz, as director. The members of this office, who called themselves the Cabal, fabricated fraudulent information on Saddam Hussein's supposed chemical and bacteriological weapons.
Le discours de Bush aux Nations Unies qui fait peur aux Irakiens a été préparé au cœur du Pentagone par une équipe d'analystes dirigée par Paul Wolfowitz et Douglas Feith. C'est le bureau des plans spéciaux.
Il lisait les notes confidentielles, il rédigeait des rapports pour faire pression sur l'Irak. Rien d'inhabituel.
Ce qui s'est passé, c'est que les renseignements bruts sont allés directement entre les mains de Cheney et Feith. Qu'ils ont fragmenté ces renseignements bruts en éliminant une grande partie, ce qui est contraire aux règles. Oh, ça correspond? Voici une source. Je ne sais pas si elle est fiable, je ne connais même pas la source. Mais voici une preuve que Saddam Hussein possède des laboratoires biologiques mobiles. Mettez-le sur le tableau. Voici une autre preuve qu'il a un programme nucléaire actif. Encore une preuve. Les autres informations pourraient montrer qu'il n'en a pas, mais celles qui l'accusent sont au tableau.
Less than a teaspoon of dry anthrax, a little bit about this amount. This is just about the amount of a teaspoon.
On February 5, 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell holds up a vial of anthrax at the United Nations Security Council and declares, "There can be no doubt that Saddam Hussein has biological weapons to kill hundreds of thousands of people." He details the existence of mobile facilities designed to produce all sorts of deadly and contagious diseases. The Secretary of State is adamant that the information comes as first-hand description by a direct witness known only to a dozen or so people.
We have first-hand descriptions of biological weapons factories on wheels and on rails. The source was an eyewitness, an Iraqi chemical engineer who supervised one of these facilities.
Dans ce temple des Nations Unies, nous sommes les gardiens d'un idéal. Nous sommes les gardiens d'une conscience. La lourde responsabilité et l'immense honneur qui sont les nôtres doivent nous conduire à donner la priorité au désarmement dans la paix.
It was France, in the person of Dominique de Villepin, who saved its honor by vetoing the United Nations intervention in this conflict. It was thus unilaterally, without a UN mandate, that the coalition organized around the United States and England launched the intensive bombing of Iraq on March 20th, 2003, followed by its invasion, under the false pretext of Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction, which we now know did not exist. After his resignation in 2004, Colin Powell publicly regretted his speech at the UN.
And as I've said on many occasions, I deeply regret that the information, some of the information, not all of it, some of the information I presented, which was multi-source, was wrong. And it is a blot on my record. But, you know, there's nothing I can do to change that blot.
His chief of staff, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, publicly regretted in an interview for PBS, "I participated in a hoax on the American people, the international community, and the United Nations Security Council." The neoconservative crypto-Zionists who have infiltrated the heart of the state apparatus are the masterminds of the 9/11 operation and its geostrategic exploitation. They are closely linked to Benjamin Netanyahu, who played a key role in the coordination between New York and Tel Aviv. Even today, Netanyahu's popularity in Israel is largely based on his ability to influence American power, which he occasionally boasts about. One of Netanyahu's close friends is Larry Silverstein, the real estate shark who, with his partner Frank Lowy, bought the Twin Towers and Tower 7 of the World Trade Center in the spring of 2001, just months before the attacks.
Silverstein seemed in a big hurry to close the deal. Even though he had been hospitalized for a car accident during the bidding operations, he asked his doctors to take him off the morphine so the deal could be finalized.
So I told the doctor, I said, kill the morphine, and I got to get my people in here, because you can't think with morphine. So they let the morphine run down. The pain was terrible, but I brought everybody together, and that's when we framed our best and final bid.
On July 24th, 2001, Larry Silverstein celebrated the acquisition of the Twin Towers with a public ceremony.
Silverstein signed the lease on the World Trade Center just 6 weeks before 9/11.
He then took out an insurance policy covering the Twin Towers for $3.2 billion in case of total destruction.
Silverstein is a member of the United Jewish Appeal, the largest fundraising organization for Israel. Israeli newspaper Haaretz reported in November 2001 that Silverstein had close ties with Netanyahu and that the two had been on friendly terms since Netanyahu's stint as Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. For years they kept in close touch. Every Sunday afternoon, New York time, Netanyahu would call Silverstein. Silverstein was caught lying on camera when asked about Tower 7, which collapsed 7 hours after the Twin Towers. He said that it was intentionally demolished at his initiative as a precautionary measure after the collapse of the neighboring Twin Towers.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Not only does this contradict the official version, but it is quite impossible to prepare the controlled demolition of a skyscraper in one day. It requires months of preparation.
Let's just think about this. Controlled demolitions cannot be engineered and rigged in a day. It takes months. And therefore, this event must have been planned in advance.
Keep your eye on that building as it's coming down.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department, and they did use the word, we're going to have to bring it down.
And these people heard explosions.
We heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. It looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out. About a second later, the bottom floor caves out. The building followed after that.
In addition to being a very powerful man, Larry Silverstein is a lucky man.
That particular morning, my wife, God bless her, had made an appointment for me at the doctor. She said, "You're not going to cancel this appointment. You're going to the dermatologist." Having been married now to the same woman for 46 years, you get this sense of determination on occasion, their voices. And I said, okay, yes, dear, I'll go. I'll go.
For Silverstein, the destruction of the Twin Towers proved very profitable. Some people thought that Silverstein had made a bad deal by buying the Twin Towers because they had to be stripped of asbestos. The removal of asbestos had been postponed indefinitely since the 1980s because of its astronomical cost, estimated at nearly $1 billion in 1989. Immediately after acquiring the Twin Towers, Silverstein renegotiated the insurance contracts to cover terrorist attacks, doubling the indemnity to $3.5 billion.
And since the terrorist attacks had been two separate events, contended Silverstein, the insurance companies would have to pay him $7 billion to rebuild what he has always been calling My Three Towers.
I will spend $7 billion on My Three Towers.
Eventually, a settlement was reached for $4.5 billion, which was still 1/3 more than the amount initially insured by Silverstein. And since on September 11, due to the terrorist attacks, Building 7 had also been destroyed, Silverstein received another $800 million to rebuild a skyscraper that had originally cost $400 million.
In close proximity to Larry Silverstein are other wealthy New York Jews intensely involved in defending Israel. His partner in the purchase of the World Trade Center, Frank Lowy, lives part of the year in Israel, where he founded the Israeli Institute for National Strategy and Policy, which operates from Tel Aviv University. Like Silverstein, he is a close friend and business partner of several Israeli statesmen, such as Ehud Olmert, Ariel Sharon, Benjamin Netanyahu, and Ehud Barak. Louis Eisenberg, the director of the New York Port Authority, who granted the lease of the World Trade Center to Silverstein and Lowy, is another notorious Zionist. Like Silverstein, he is a member of the United Jewish Appeal. Billionaire Ronald Loiter also played a key role in awarding the World Trade Center to Silverstein and Lowy as chairman of the New York State Privatization Commission. He is a key member of the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations, as well as the Anti-Defamation League and many other Zionist organizations. He has been a president of the World Jewish Congress since 2007 and founded Israel's Loiter School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy. Also noteworthy is Zionist billionaire Maurice Greenberg, CEO of AIG, the insurance company that insured the Twin Towers. In July 2001, Greenberg took the precaution of reinsuring the contract with competitors so that he did not have to pay anything after the attacks. Since 1993, Maurice Greenberg had been associated with Jules Kroll, founder of Kroll's Incorporated, a security and espionage company employing former CIA and FBI agents and providing security throughout the World Trade Center complex. Since 1999, Maurice Greenberg's son, Jeffrey Greenberg, had been CEO of Marsh & McLennan, a company also owned by Jules Kroll. Marsh & McLennan happened to occupy floors 93 to 100 of the North Tower, precisely the floors where the American Airlines Boeing is supposed to have crashed. In November 2000, Marsh & McLennan's board of directors included Louis Paul Bremer, then chairman of the National Commission on Terrorism, who appeared on NBC just 2 hours after the North Tower explosion to name bin Laden as the prime suspect. He was perfectly calm as 400 of his employees were reported missing.
It is a day that will change our lives. It's a day when the war that the terrorists declared on the United States, and after all, they did declare war on us, has been brought home to the United States in a much more dramatic way than we've seen before. So it will change our lives.
In 2003, Bremer would be appointed Administrator of the Coalition Provisional Authority of Iraq. In this capacity, he would oversee the embezzlement of tens of billions of dollars intended for the country's reconstruction. There are many other troubling links between Israeli elites and the New York bombings. There is the moving story of Zim, Israel Navigational, a shipping giant 49% owned by the Jewish state and used as a front for its intelligence services. Its offices were in the North Tower of the World Trade Center, but the company had begun moving its 200 employees in March 2001 and completed its move on September 4th, 2001, 1 week before the attacks. Interviewed by USA Today on November 17th, CEO Shal Cohen-Mintz said the move had been an act of God. Some suspect that Zim Israel Navigational's move had been a cover for the introduction of explosives into the Twin Towers. A serious investigation should also look at the Odigo instant messaging system based in Israel. Odigo has a function that allows recipients to be selected by nationality. Warning messages were broadcast to Israeli nationals over the Odigo platform 2 hours before the planes crashed, as reported by the Washington Post on October 4, 2001. The first plane hit the North Tower at the exact time announced, almost to the minute, in the words of Alex Demandis, Odigo's vice president. Misha Makover, Odigo's CEO, was quoted by an Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, as saying, "It may just have been someone who was joking, and it turned out they accidentally got it right." As we have said, the Israeli operation theory does not preclude the involvement of members of the U.S. administration acting in the service of U.S. imperialism. However, the best way to understand how these two levels fit together is to think of the relationship between Israel and the United States as the relationship between a parasite and its host. It is no exaggeration to say that U.S. foreign policy today is parasitized by Israel. To a large extent, the American deep state is dominated by Israel. Let us examine this a little more closely. The imperialist destiny of the United States was clearly explained by Zbigniew Brzezinski in his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard. Brzezinski, a prominent member of the Council on Foreign Relations, was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. For several decades, he led a geopolitical strategy aimed at preventing any alliance between Russia and Europe. In this vision inherited from Britain's Great Game, Afghanistan played the role of a buffer state, and it was Brzezinski who, under Carter, instigated the destabilization of the secular and pro-Soviet Afghan regime by financing and arming the Mujahideen.
That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
After the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise to power of the Taliban, the control of Afghanistan remained a priority for the strategists of the Great Game. In addition to geostrategic interests, there were also gas interests, because the United States had long been planning to build an oil pipeline linking Turkmenistan and the Indian Ocean. The neocons struck an opportunistic alliance with this strategy, but their objectives were very different. They were not interested in Afghanistan. What they wanted was a new war against Iraq, followed by a conflagration of the Middle East, leading to the crumbling of all current and potential enemies of Israel. Brzezinski, for his part, was hostile to the destruction of Iraq and had already spoken out against Bush Sr.'s first Gulf War.
An American military invasion of Iraq would be likely to set off a chain reaction that could bog America down in a variety of prolonged security operations in a setting of intensified political instability. It is also possible that the destruction of Iraq by America and the resulting radicalization of the Arabs might leave Israel, armed as it already is with nuclear weapons, more tempted to use its military force to impose its will in this volatile region. How will all this affect the area's sensitive balance of power? I believe that none of the above possible developments would be in the American interest.
The neocons would therefore encourage a muscular American imperial policy in order to direct it against Iraq at first, and then towards Syria, Libya, and Iran.
You mentioned military action in Afghanistan, perhaps Iraq. Any other parts of the world as part of this campaign?
Well, we know the countries that have been involved in terrorism. Iran is involved, Syria is involved. There are parts of Lebanon, principally under Syrian control, that are bases for terror.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
The speed of Afghanistan's invasion after 9/11 proves that it had already been prepared. The following hypothesis can therefore be put forward. In July 2001, in order to put an end to the Taliban regime, either the White House, the State Department, or the National Security Council decided to stage a false flag attack to be blamed on Osama bin Laden, who was exiled in Afghanistan in order to justify the overthrow of the Taliban regime under the pretext of a manhunt. This would also help the Saudis, allies of the Bush family, eager to rid themselves of the black sheep that was Osama bin Laden. The story of a suicide attack by al-Qaeda hijackers was deemed sufficient to justify a military operation in Afghanistan. It was therefore decided to create, under the cover of NORAD exercises, the illusion of a hijacked airliner crashing into the Pentagon, and the news would provide ample justifications for a manhunt in Afghanistan. Its real goal would be the overthrow of the Taliban and the takeover of Afghanistan by the United States.
Le pays est désormais dirigé par un opposant aux talibans, Hamid Karzai, et connaît des élections démocratiques.
Thanks to their senior agents in the Pentagon, notably Paul Wolfowitz, Israeli deep state officials were aware of this project. They even encouraged it. They decided to hijack it for the benefit of the Zionist imperial project. With the help of their Super Saiyanim in New York, they would give the operation the scale it required, taking everyone by surprise. To start a war of civilizations in the Middle East, a single plane crashing into the Pentagon and causing only a few dozen deaths would not be enough. Something much more spectacular would be needed, like the destruction of the Twin Towers on live television and the news of several thousand deaths. The project had been planned for a long time.
The next thing you'll see is the militant Islamists bringing down the World Trade Center.
Larry Silverstein, Frank Lowy, Louis Eisenberg, and Morris Greenberg were mobilized. It would be an opportunity for them to make a lucrative deal on the Twin Towers without having to remove its asbestos. Well-informed Jewish personalities also took advantage of the situation by making timely stock trades.
Dans les jours qui ont précédé le 11 septembre, le 6, 7 septembre et même le 10 septembre, la veille des attentats, on a spéculé à la baisse, on a acheté massivement des actions des deux compagnies aériennes dont les avions ont été détournés. Pas d'autres compagnies. Mais j'ai réussi à retrouver effectivement une banque d'affaires qui a effectué donc une partie de ces opérations. Et c'est une banque d'affaires importante qui est une filiale aujourd'hui de la Deutsche Bank.
C'est Alex Brown.
Alex Brown, exactement. Et j'ai découvert, curieusement, que l'ancien responsable de cette banque pendant des années avait démissionné juste avant, d'ailleurs, et vous savez où il est maintenant? Il est numéro 3 de la CIA.
Ah ouais.
Il s'appelle Budsy Krongard, et c'était l'homme au sein de la CIA chargé de surveiller justement toutes les situations anormales sur les marchés financiers.
Confident in their control of mainstream media, the Zionists easily bamboozled small-timers. George W. Bush, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, unwittingly caught up in the geopolitical machinations that went way beyond them. Bush was forced to endorse the invasion of Iraq that his father had refused the Zionists 10 years earlier. Geostrategists of the great imperial game, such as Zbigniew Brzezinski and his friends at the Council on Foreign Relations, were sidelined after having played their part.
The one in Afghanistan was necessary. They attacked us from Afghanistan. We had to go in and clean out al-Qaeda.
Their support for the invasion of Afghanistan made their protest against the invasion of Iraq barely audible. When Brzezinski testified before the Senate in February 2007, denounced the latter as, quote, a historical, strategic, and moral calamity driven by Manichaean impulses and imperial hubris, his protest made no more impact than his regret, in a 2012 interview, that the United States followed Israel like a stupid mule.
I don't think there is any implicit obligation of the United States to follow, like, a stupid mule, whatever the Israelis do. If they decide to start a war, simply on the assumption that we'll automatically be drawn into it, I think it is the obligation of friendship to say, well, you're not going to be making national decisions for us.
Brzezinski would then disappear from the media scene, like a useful idiot, now useless and inconvenient. The scenario of an American operation hacked by Israel is only a theory. According to this theory, the attack on the Pentagon in Washington and the attack on the New York Twin Towers are two separate events. The simulated plane crash at the Pentagon is an operation of the American services, while the attack on the Twin Towers is entirely orchestrated by Zionist elements, taking the Pentagon strategists by surprise and bringing them unwillingly into their conspiracy. Securing control of the investigation from the start is a crucial element of an operation like 9/11. We have already mentioned the role of Michael Chertoff at the Justice Department. We must also mention Philip Zelikow, member of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, PFIAB, and appointed in January 2003 as Executive Director of the 9/11 Commission. It was he who oversaw the recruitment of all commission members. He coordinated the different investigative groups, forbidding them to communicate with each other and setting them up with the sole mission of proving the official story.
Before the staff even had its first meeting, Zelikow had written, along with his former professor Ernest May, a detailed outline of the Commission's report, complete, as Sheenan put it, with chapter headings, subheadings, and sub-subheadings.
He inserted in the final report several references to Iraq's alleged involvement in international terrorism and even tried to include false evidence of a link between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda.
Zelikow was the author of a very important document issued by the White House in September 2002 that really turned military doctrine on its head and said that the United States could become involved in preemptive war, preemptive defense, that we could attack a nation that didn't pose an immediate military threat to this country. And obviously in September 2002, it sure appeared that that document was being written with one target in mind, Iraq. Now, as I say, the author of the document at the time was anonymous. We didn't know that Philip Zelikow had written this thing. And that becomes known, I think, widely on the staff only in the final months of the 9/11 Commission investigation.
Why would Iraq attack America or use nuclear weapons against us? Zelikow asked an audience at the University of Virginia in September 2002. In a rare moment of candor, Zelikow proceeded to explain that the real reason for preemptive war against Iraq was the threat against Israel.
According to Wikipedia, Zelikow describes himself as an expert in social engineering, who studies how public myths can be made by searing or molding events that take on a transcendent importance and therefore retain their power even as the experiencing generation passes from the scene. In December 1998, Zelikow co-authored an article for Foreign Affairs titled Catastrophic Terrorism, in which he speculated on what could have happened if the 1993 World Trade Center attack had been committed with a nuclear bomb. Quote, "Such an act of catastrophic terrorism would be a watershed event in American history. Like Pearl Harbor, this event would divide our past and future into a before and after. The United States might respond with draconian measures, scaling back civil liberties, allowing wider surveillance of citizens, detention of suspects, and the use of deadly force." End quote. Note, once again, the reference to Pearl Harbor. Control of the official investigation is one thing, but it would still prove necessary to secure the means of controlling the opposition that would inevitably result from this biased investigation. It is for this purpose that the repression and criminalization of the so-called conspiracy theories has intensified over the years. One of the designers of strategies to fight conspiracy theories in the United States is Cass Sunstein. He was appointed in January 2009 to head the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. To combat conspiracy theories, Sunstein advocates various methods, including cognitive infiltration of conspiracy groups. In this way, and I quote, "Government agents and their allies, acting either virtually or in real space and either openly or anonymously, will undermine the crippled epistemology of believers by planting doubts." End quote.
Here's another thing that I think is less straightforward but pretty interesting, is that if people are told you're wrong, they tend to get their back up. And that might even make them fight harder on behalf of their original conviction. If common cause is made with them over some dimension first, then there's more receptivity. To the extent that opposition to the official 9/11 story cannot be totally eliminated,
It must be infiltrated to divert suspicion away from the real culprits. One approach is to ensure that those who challenge the Islamic narrative are led into a purely domestic line of inquiry with no mention of Israel. This is the purpose of the most visible opposition slogan, 9/11 was an inside job. In a way, the inside job theory itself functions as a false flag, as it focuses the accusation exclusively on the United States, while protecting the real masterminds of the operation who are in fact loyal to another state. But the inside job theory is not entirely false, as U.S. institutions are indeed compromised in the operation. In the theory which I have laid out of Israel essentially hijacking a U.S. Secret Services operation, the double false flag principle is based on the principle of nested operations. The Israeli operation hides behind the American operation that it has hijacked and amplified. This principle is well illustrated by the double message contained in the repeated references to Pearl Harbor. For the masses captivated by the official narrative, Pearl Harbor evokes a treacherous attack by a foreign power, in this case Japan. Those who believe the official version of World War II will have no difficulty believing in the official version of 9/11.
We've been trained to think that we're invincible. And now our proudest ships has been destroyed by an enemy we considered inferior.
In contrast, for those better informed, the attack on Pearl Harbor is a proven case of U.S. government willingly sacrificing thousands of American lives for a pretext to enter the war against the Axis powers. Therefore, for those informed skeptics, the reference to Pearl Harbor is an invitation to think of 9/11 in the same way and suspect that the U.S. government either allowed or provoked the 9/11 attacks to justify military intervention in the Middle East.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked.
Our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Pearl Harbor is therefore a key word that has been attached to the 9/11 attacks to serve as bait for the opposition. Researchers who have moved beyond the inside job theory have realized that the 9/11 truth movement was largely channeled from its inception by individuals and organizations intent on focusing suspicions on President Bush and his entourage, while obscuring the interests and covert actions of Israel and its neoconservative agents.
George Bush carried out 9/11. Dick Cheney, in September of 2000, openly wrote a document called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And he said, we need a Pearl Harbor event. The U.S. government wants to carry out terror attacks to blame it on their enemies. 9/11 was a self-inflicted wound. 9/11 was an inside job.
One of the very first productions of the controlled opposition was the 2005 film Loose Change, produced by Alex Jones. The film makes no mention of Israel at all. Even the communitarian loyalties of PNAC neocons, as well as their proven loyalty to the State of Israel, are glossed over. From the very beginning, the filmmakers build their argument on a comparison with Operation Northwoods, a false flag operation devised in 1962 by Pentagon generals looking for a pretext to invade Cuba.
The plans included starting rumors about Cuba using clandestine radio, landing friendly Cubans inside the base to stage attacks, and finally, destroying a drone aircraft over Cuban waters. The passengers, federal agents in reality, would allegedly be college students on vacation.
However, Operation Northwoods was never carried out. Imagine if instead of mentioning Operation Northwoods, which never happened, the documentary that spearheaded the opposition movement had mentioned the attack on the USS Liberty, a real and well-documented false flag attack by Israel on its American ally in 1967. The 9/11 truth movement would have moved in a completely different direction than that championed by conspiracy heavyweights like Alex Jones.
Adolf Hitler staged a fake attack on his own military base. That's how World War II started.
As we have said in the introduction, until we understand the global agenda of the 9/11 conspirators, we will remain unable to prevent the full implementation of their agenda, which is already well underway. It is now time to conclude and give a general perspective on this project. The scenario in this film of an American operation hacked by Israel is only a theory. In this theory, the core group of American Israelis and Zionists who planned 9/11 is a very powerful covert network. At the heart of this network are infiltrators at the highest levels of the U.S. administration. Although they have adopted the label neoconservatives for their public image, enough is known about their machinations to understand that their only concern is the interest of Israel as they understand it. The neoconservative network was initially formed around Leo Strauss, a German Jew who immigrated to the United States in the 1930s and became a professor of political philosophy at the University of Chicago. Strauss's views are difficult to pin down because he delivers them only through his very particular exegesis of great thinkers of the past with whom he identifies. Moreover, the necessity of concealment recurs as a leitmotif in his books. Strauss's disciples to whom he reserved his esoteric philosophy were exclusively Jewish. According to Strauss, superior minds whose vocation is to govern the masses in an occult manner must shape public opinion through myths. One of their primary functions is the demonization of an enemy, real or imaginary. Strauss was amazed by the ability of film and television to construct myths and shape mentalities. He particularly admired the Manichaean qualities of Hollywood's Wild West myth.
Strauss was a great fan of American television. Gunsmoke was his great favorite, and he would hurry home from the seminar to have a quick dinner so that he could be at his seat before the television set when Gunsmoke went on. But he felt that this was good, this show. This had a salutary effect on the American public because it showed the conflict between good and evil in a way that would be immediately intelligible to everyone.
Let's see what happens. No.
The hero has a white hat. He's faster on the draw than the bad man. The good guy wins. And it's not just that the good guy wins, but that the values are clear.
Let us remember that it was the Straussian neocons who made it possible for a Western movie actor to be elected President of the United States. Although he publicly defined himself as an atheist and a non-religious philosopher, Strauss was very attached to his Jewishness. He gave a lecture at the Hillel Foundation in 1962 entitled Why We Remain Jews, which was not made public until the 1990s. In it, he revealed that, quote, since a very, very early time, the main theme of my reflections has been what is called the Jewish question, and he encourages Jews to, quote, return to the Jewish faith, return to the faith of our ancestors. By this he meant not faith in God, but faith in the higher destiny of the Jewish people. Strauss developed a political vision that can be described as world Zionism. He gave Israel credit for having accomplished an act of national cleansing or purification by prohibiting intermarriage and a reassertion of the difference between Jews and non-Jews. But he also criticized political Zionism, which aimed only at the establishment of one nation among others. According to Strauss, Israel must retain its specificity, which is to be everywhere and to transcend national borders. Strauss defended a strategy of assimilation for the purpose of dominating the West. He illustrated his argument with a long quote from Nietzsche, in which Nietzsche predicts that, quote, at some time Europe may fall like a perfectly ripe fruit into the hands of the Jews. Strauss presented this as, and I quote, the most profound and most radical statement on assimilation which I have read.
Assimilation cannot mean abandoning the inheritance, but only giving it another direction, transforming it. And assimilation cannot be an end. It could only be a way to an end.
Another important point about Strauss is his admiration for the political philosopher Machiavelli, of whom he makes a radical reading. Rejecting the interpretation of those who minimize Machiavelli's immorality, He argues that, on the contrary, his genius comes from his absolute immorality. In Strauss's view, Machiavelli is the perfect patriot because, and I quote, he is more concerned with the salvation of his fatherland than with the salvation of his soul. According to Strauss, Machiavelli placed no moral limits on what he was willing to do for his nation. Radical Machiavellianism and full-blown Zionism are so intimately linked for Strauss that his disciple Michael Ledeen hypothesizes that Machiavelli was a secret Jew because, as he writes in the Jewish World Review, listen to his political philosophy and you will hear the Jewish music. Based on his own peculiar interpretation of Plato, Strauss defended the necessity of what he calls the noble lie in politics. According to his disciple, Abram Shulsky, Strauss believed that, and I quote, deception is the norm in political life, a rule that Shulsky applied as director of the Office of Special Plans, where the false information about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction was fabricated. Strauss's world Zionism and his radical Machiavellianism are the two keys to the neoconservative strategy. Their goal, through the 9/11 operation, was to trigger a new world war that would benefit Israel without shedding Israeli blood. In a Wall Street Journal article of November 20th, 2001, neocon Elliot Cohen referred to the war on terror as World War IV, and the Cold War being counted as World War III because of the benefits Israel gained from it in 1967. The World War IV theme was also popularized by Norman Podhoretz in a 2002 article in the magazine Commentary titled How to Win World War IV, and later in a book titled World War IV, The Long Struggle Against Islamo-Fascism.
Somewhere from 10 to 15% of the Muslim world is either passively or actively sympathetic to the Islamo-fascist cause. Well, you're talking about 150 million to 200 million people, and that adds up to more people than communists and fascists and the Nazis or fascists combined ever recruited. There is a very good chance, unless we're extremely lucky, that they will get their hands on weapons of mass destruction, and including nuclear weapons, and there's not the slightest doubt that they would be happy to use them against us. They certainly would have on 9/11 if they'd been able to.
This world war, declared against an invisible and supposedly omnipresent enemy, must allow all the enemies of Israel to be targeted under the most fallacious pretexts.
We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them. Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
General Wesley Clark reported in his 2003 book, Winning Modern Wars, and repeated to anyone who would listen that 2 months after 9/11, the decision had been made in Wolfowitz's entourage at the Pentagon to attack 7 nations in 5 years.
7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
It is no coincidence that all of these countries are declared enemies of Israel, nor is it a coincidence that there are 7 of them. For the 7 nations enemies of Israel are a well-known biblical motif in Jewish tradition. According to Deuteronomy 7:1-2, Yahweh shall deliver to Israel 7 nations greater and mightier than you. Yahweh your God will deliver them up before you and will confuse them with great confusion until they are destroyed. He will deliver their kings unto your hand, and you shall make their name perish from under the sky. The promise of world domination by Israel is the heart of the message of the Hebrew Bible. Yahweh will make you high above all nations that he has made, in praise, in name, and in honor. The peoples of the world, seeing that you bear Yahweh's name, will all be afraid of you. You will make many nations your subjects, yet you will be subject to none. Through the prophets, Yahweh promised Israel the subjugation of other peoples, or their destruction if they resisted. For that nation and kingdom that will not serve you shall perish. Yes, those nations shall be utterly wasted. You will also drink the milk of the nations, and will nurse from royal breasts. and I will shake all nations. The precious things of all nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory, says Yahweh of armies. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine. All the great figures of Zionism have shared more or less openly this globalist and supremacist worldview, for the Bible has always been for them the basis of Israel's national story. David Ben-Gurion, the father of the state of Israel, described by his biographers as a biblical prophet, predicted in 1962 that within a quarter of a century, Jerusalem, and I quote, will be the seat of the Supreme Court of mankind to settle all controversies among federated continents as prophesied by Isaiah, end quote. Indeed, Isaiah 2:3-4 prophesies that one day all nations will pay homage to the mountain of Yahweh, to the house of God of Jacob, for the law shall go out of Zion, and Yahweh's word from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will decide concerning many peoples. In other words, Israel will dictate its law to the world.
Même si on peut imaginer, rêver d'un Jérusalem devenant capitale de la planète, qui sera un jour unifié autour d'un gouvernement mondial. C'est un joli lieu pour un gouvernement mondial.
The destruction of multiple states hostile to Israel, made possible by the shock of 9/11, was a decisive step toward the realization of the destiny that Israel set itself more than 2,000 years ago. The Zionists have achieved this feat thanks to their control over mainstream media on the one hand and the entertainment industry on the other, through which they have managed to plunge mankind into a state of collective hypnosis unprecedented in human history. It is difficult to conceive how people will ever be able to extricate themselves from this mental control and resist the implementation of the New World Order that Israeli elites are working on. But one thing seems certain: hope lies in raising awareness and mobilizing awake citizens.
Where else but Israel could we Americans mourn our fellow citizens struck down by terror, surrounded by friends who know, but truly know, our pain?
I think having this memorial in Jerusalem that reminds us of the attack against America and the West is particularly appropriate because Jerusalem is the source of the spiritual legacy of Western civilization.